Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is fret. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear fret used is to mean to be constantly or visibly worried or anxious. And a related way we use that verb, the second definition here, is to cause someone worry or to cause them to worry, I would say. So these first two definitions very much connected. Um, and I would like to suggest when I hear people using this particular verb, the idea is that this action of worrying is continuing, right? It's not something that just lasts for a short amount of time. When most people are using this, they're implying the worry is continuing for a great length of time. A third way you might hear the verb fret used is to mean to gradually wear away something by rubbing. Right? I looked for some different examples of this third definition. I saw some in literature, I saw a few in science, again, kind of talking about something uh, disappearing because something else is rubbing and eroding it maybe away. I know I've got one example sentence a little bit later in the video if you want to see a connection to that third definition. But for now, you should know that fret is a regular verb. And when I go to make both the progressive and past tense forms of this verb, I am going to have a spelling change. And the reason for that is fret is a one syllable word. It ends with a consonant vowel consonant pattern. And what this means is I need to double the T anytime I'm adding a suffix that begins with a vowel letter. So you're going to see two T's before the ing ending to make fretting. You're also going to see a second T before the ed ending to make fretted. And you might notice as I say that past tense and participle forms of the verb, I'm adding an extra syllable to it. So I'm making an id sound. That's because my base verb ends with a T sound. So anytime we have an ending T or D sound and we add ed, that's when we're going to be adding that extra syllable and making an id sound. Okay? So I do have a couple phrasal verbs that I think you might encounter. What you're going to notice about fret about and fret over is that their definitions connect back to the first definition of the verb. So both fret about and fret over mean that someone is feeling anxious or worried or very concerned about someone or something. And again, I want to add to it that idea of having these particular feelings generally lasts for a longer amount of time. It's not something that for 5 seconds one does. Usually it's continuing for some time. So let's take a look at our two example sentences here. The first is, he's been fretting about the exam all week. So maybe you've had this feeling, right? You have a big test or exam coming up, right? And you feel nervous. Oh no, what if I don't do well? What's going to be on it, right? So having those thoughts and feelings continue and continue, right? I think that sentence maybe helps us understand the verb a little bit better. Another example sentence here, she always frets over her children. Okay? Um, I know I picked a female pronoun here, she, but I think could work with any parent, right? Most parents can have this feeling of being anxious or worried or concerned about their children, what they're doing, their health, their friends, all their education, right? All of these things as they grow up, and they're worried and concerned many times about different things at different stages of their children's lives. But now let's move on and practice using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today we're going to practice the present perfect and the present perfect progressive. let's start with the present perfect. We can use this verb tense to talk about an action that was completed in the past but at an unknown point in time. We can also use it to describe an action that started in the past and continues into the present. When I go to make the present perfect, I'm going to need two parts to my verb. So I've got to pay attention to my subject, and if my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have and then the participle form of my verb. And again, because fret is a regular verb, my participle looks the same as my past tense form. Okay. Now, if the subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has and then the participle form of the verb. You can see that in my first example here. The acid has fretted the metal layer. Sorry, let's try that again. The acid has fretted the metal layer. So here, there's our third definition, kind of gradually wearing away at something, kind of rubbing it away. And here we're talking about a substance that has made the metal disappear. Now, if you want to make a negative present perfect sentence, what we're going to do is start with our subject and then use have or has, whichever form matches that subject, then use not, and then the participle. You might hear the contractions haven't or hasn't, and then the participle. I've used the contraction form in my example sentence. They haven't fretted over how she can get dinner on the table quickly. Okay, so perhaps we're talking about a family, and for whatever reason, this is not a concern, not something anyone in the family is worrying about. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, I'll start with have or has, whichever form matches my subject. That subject comes next. Then you're going to see the participle form of the verb. Here's the last present perfect example. Have you fretted about how artificial intelligence will impact your work? Right? So, big question for many of us. Have we thought about, is my job going to be impacted? Am I going to be replaced by a machine or by a computer, right? For some people, that is something that concerns or worries them. Now, it might not be something they think about every day, but perhaps at some point in the past, they've had some thoughts, right? That would be a reason to use the present perfect, right? Kind of thinking back in time up until now. Have you ever worried about this particular issue? Now let's move on and talk about the present perfect progressive. In this verb tense, many times we are focused on an action that started in the past and one that is continuing into the present. It may even continue into the future. Many people will ask kind of why then do I have present perfect progressive if you told me I could also use present perfect to describe something that started in the past and continues? And the way many people are using present perfect progressive in the United States today is really to focus on the length of time that a particular action has been ongoing. Now, some teachers and some textbooks call this present perfect continuous, and that is just great. It means exactly the same thing. The reason I use present perfect progressive, though, is I like my students to see those three-letter P's, and I try and help them remember that they will need three parts to make the verb. So again, we're going to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, we'll use have, then the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. But if the subject is he, she, or it, we'll use has been, and then the ing form of the verb. You can see that in my example here. Everyone has been fretting about higher food and fuel prices for 2 years, right? There's a sentence that's focusing on how long a particular action has been continuing. Now, I chose to use the subject everyone here because this came up in a class recently. So You might hear the words everyone, everybody, and think of a large group of people, but these words are treated as singular in English. So we've got to use it, has here. Sorry, we would use is with it, has, a third person singular, whatever your verb tense might be. But everyone has, everybody has, same idea. Okay, the word is singular, even though we may be referring to many people. Now let's move on and talk about negative present perfect progressive sentences to do this. Again, I start with my subject and I pay attention to it because I'm going to use either have or has next, then not, then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. You might also hear those same contractions we talked about earlier. I've used one in this example. The team hasn't been fretting over high expectations this season. Right? So this could apply to many different teams, but that idea of their season has started, right? They weren't worried. They're still not worrying or they're still not feeling anxious, right? That action or the lack of that action is continuing. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect progressive. To do this, I start with have or has, whichever form matches my subject. That subject comes next. Then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's my last example. Have economists been fretting about a recession recently? And anytime with our yes or no questions here, we could do yes, they have, or no, they haven't. Okay. Let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb fret. And the first word we'll discuss today is the noun form of this word. You'll notice it has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation. When we use fret as a noun, it generally means that someone is in a state of worry or a state of anxiety. An example of this: his parents were in a fret when he was 2 hours late. All right. Maybe you can identify with this, but I know my mom in particular, if I was ever late, immediately she would start to worry I had been in a car accident or something bad had happened to me. So if you can identify with that feeling, you can understand both the noun and the verb here. Another related word you might encounter is the adjective fretful. Um, this can be a feeling, or we could be describing something that is expressing some distress, a restlessness, or even some irritability. An example of this might be, there was a fretful wait for news after the volcano eruption and tsunami. Right? I hope you can't identify with this particular feeling, but I know there are many people who can. If you have ever kind of had to wait to find out if someone you love is okay after a natural disaster or some type of emergency, right? That period of waiting, right? You might feel very restless. You might feel a little irritable, or you might feel distressed, just again, connected to that sense because you are so worried. Okay. Another related word for us today, it's the adverb fretfully. So this is again going to connect back to our adjective here. So now we might be describing an action word, a verb, or we could be describing an adjective, but we're describing something that is done in a way that expresses distress, restlessness, or irritability. An example of this might be, the interviewee clutched fretfully at her necklace while she waited, right? So again, it might be kind of a nervousness. I think when I read that example sentence, I was thinking of kind of the restlessness, right? Somebody who needs to be moving or doing something, who just cannot sit perfectly still. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.